What would you do if one snowy morning you stepped into your backyard shed and found a woman sleeping on the floor, clutching a journal where she had written your son's name over and over? This isn't just a story about a struggling, single dad. It's a story about healing, about love showing up in the most unexpected places, and about how sometimes the family we choose finds us when we least expect it. If you love emotional, heartwarming stories that restore your faith in people, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any of the beautiful chapters coming your way. Now, let's begin our story. A struggling single dad found a woman sleeping in his shed. She'd written his son's name in a journal. The first snowfall of December had come early that year, thick and uninvited, like a guest who overstayed. And their welcome, it clung to the windowsills of Eli Turner's small cedar frame house like regret. The wind howled through the trees behind the property, rattling the old shed doors and creaking the eaves with a mournful persistence that reminded Eli of the winters he'd spent alone, too many now to count. It was just after 6 in the morning when he stepped out into the pale blue stillness of dawn. The sky was beginning to lighten, but the air held the sting of ice and the silence of everything being buried under white. He pulled his flannel jacket tighter around his frame, the coffee still warm in his thermos, and made his way down the narrow path he'd shoveled the night before. His boots crunched through the snow toward the shed, where he kept the firewood stacked high and dry. The plan was simple: grab an armload of kindling before Milo woke up and get the stove going. His son liked waking up to warmth, and Eli, who had grown up in a house where that wasn't always the case, made sure of it. But when he pulled open the shed door, something stopped him cold. There, curled in a sleeping bag on the far side of the shed, next to the pile of wood and a half-empty thermos of her own, was a woman. She stirred at the sound, blinking slowly like someone coming up from deep water. Her hair was matted, face pale, and her coat, far too thin for this kind of cold, was zipped all the way up to her chin. A worn backpack was tucked beneath her head like a pillow, and beside her, just barely visible in the half-light, lay a battered leather-bound notebook. Eli stared for a moment, uncertain if he was still dreaming. Then, with the reflexes of a man who'd spent the last decade putting someone else first, he found his voice. "You all right?" he asked, keeping his tone low but firm. The woman didn't answer at first. She sat up slowly, blinking at him with eyes the color of thawing river ice. Fear flickered there, but not defiance, just exhaustion. She didn't reach for a weapon, didn't scramble away, just looked at him like she was trying to decide if he was real. "I didn't touch anything," she said hoarsely. "I just needed to get out of the wind." Eli exhaled, rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. He should call someone. This wasn't safe, not for her, not for Milo. But the woman looked more fragile than dangerous. She looked lost. "You can't stay in here," he said after a pause. "It's not heated. You'll freeze." "I've been colder," she murmured, almost like she was speaking to herself. "Still," he said, shifting his stance. "Come inside, just for a minute, warm up, I'll make coffee." The woman blinked again. "Why would you help me?" Eli thought of Milo, asleep under 3 blankets, and the memory of his late wife's voice in his ear. "Be kind, Eli, even when it's hard." "Because it's too damn cold not to," he said. Inside, the house smelled of old wood, coffee, and cinnamon, left over from the rolls Milo had begged him to buy last week. The woman stood uncertainly near the doorway, clutching her backpack like a life raft. Eli didn't ask questions. He handed her a steaming mug, pointed her toward the rocking chair by the stove, and set about stoking the fire. Milo came padding down the stairs a few minutes later, rubbing his eyes. He paused when he saw the stranger, but didn't say anything. He was a quiet kid, intuitive in a way that had always impressed his teachers. "Hi," the woman said gently. "I'm Grace." Milo nodded, still blinking sleep from his eyes. "I'm Milo." Eli watched them from the kitchen. There was something in the way she looked at his son, like she recognized him, not just in the way strangers sometimes smile at kids, but in a way that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He turned back toward the stove, trying to shake it off. Grace didn't say much. Over breakfast, she picked at her toast and accepted a second cup of coffee without asking. She told Eli she'd been passing through, that she'd run out of money, and that she had no one left to call. "I'll be on my way," she said quietly. Just needed a night out of the cold. But Eli, who had once sat in a hospital hallway, with a 6-month-old baby and no clue how to go on, recognized the desperation behind her calm. "You can stay a few nights," he offered gruffly, eyes fixed on the coffee mug in his hand. "Just until you get your bearings. There's a spare room upstairs." She looked at him for a long moment like she was searching for the catch. Then she nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice just above a whisper. Later that evening, after Grace had gone upstairs to rest, Eli passed by the mudroom where she'd left her bag. The notebook was half open on top of it. He shouldn't have looked, but he did. And written across the top of the page, over and over in soft looping script, was the name Milo Turner. The upstairs bedroom hadn't been used in years. It still smelled faintly of cedar and old books, and the wallpaper peeled just slightly near the window. Eli had thrown on a fresh set of sheets before Grace climbed the stairs, but the space remained. What it had always been, bare, functional, impersonal. That night, as snow coated the world in silence, Grace lay awake in that narrow bed with the covers pulled to her chin, the journal clutched to her chest. She hadn't meant for him to see it. She hadn't meant to stay. Downstairs, Eli couldn't sleep either. He sat in the living room long after Milo had gone to bed, the fire throwing shifting patterns of amber across the wood-paneled walls. The name he'd seen scrawled in that journal haunted him. Not just Milo, but Milo Turner, repeated over and over as though etched into her soul. He should have confronted her. He should have asked what she wanted, why she'd written his son's name, why she'd been sleeping in his shed. But the words wouldn't come. And stranger still, a part of him didn't want to know. Not yet. Morning came reluctantly, as if the sun itself was hesitant to rise on the tension lodged between the three of them. Grace was already in the kitchen when Eli came down. Her coat on, hair pulled back neatly. She was sipping coffee like she belonged. "I'll be gone by noon," she said before he could open his mouth. "You don't have to leave," Eli replied, surprising even himself. "It's not like I rent the room." "Out." Grace gave a small, dry smile. "You should be asking questions." "I'd be asking questions." "I am," he said. "Just not out loud." They stood in the quiet for a moment, steam curling up from their mugs like breath in winter air. When Milo came in, hair a mess of cowlicks, Grace greeted him with a warmth Eli hadn't seen in her before. "You like school?" she asked. "Not really," Milo shrugged. "But there's a dog that hangs out by the fence sometimes. I sneak him part of my sandwich." "What kind of sandwich?" "Peanut butter and honey. It's his favorite." She laughed, and something softened in her. "That was my favorite too." Eli didn't miss the flicker in her expression, the way she looked at Milo when she thought no one was watching. It wasn't pity or curiosity. It was deeper than that, familiar even, like memory. Later that day, while Grace was upstairs folding the blanket she'd brought down the night before, Eli stood outside her door. He knocked once, gently. She opened it, guarded. "I didn't steal anything," she said. "I didn't think you did. You looked through my journal." Eli nodded. He didn't lie. "I did." She waited. He didn't ask the question she expected. Instead, he said, "Who are you, Grace?" And for the first time since she'd arrived, She didn't look away. "I'm no one important," she said quietly. "Just someone who made a mistake a long time ago, and someone who's been trying to make peace with it ever since." "That peace got anything to do with my son's name being in your journal?" Her hand tightened on the edge of the door. She didn't answer. "Are you here for him?" Eli asked, voice rough, protective. "No," she said quickly. "No. I swear I'm not here to take him or disrupt anything. I just needed to know he was okay, that's all." Eli searched her face. She wasn't lying. He'd spent enough years reading people at their best and worst to know the difference. "You saw the name on the adoption papers," he said slowly. She looked down, ashamed. "I did, and you tracked us down. I didn't mean to come this close, I swear. I didn't expect to see him, to see you, and then the storm hit, and you ended up in my shed." Grace gave a weak nod. "I wasn't planning any of this." Eli exhaled, leaned against the doorframe. "Well, life's rarely planned." For dinner that night they shared leftover beef stew and biscuits. Milo talked about school, about how his teacher let them bring in ornaments to decorate the class tree. Grace listened with her chin propped on one hand, smiling like someone watching an old home movie. Afterward, when Eli walked her to the stairs, he paused. "I've got rules," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "I figured. No smoking. No strange guests. And no sleeping in the shed again." She laughed softly. "Deal." He started to walk away, then stopped. "You sure you're not here for him?" Grace's voice was steady but fragile. "I think I was here for me." That night, Eli sat at the foot of his bed, journal in hand. He hadn't read more than that first page, had forced himself not to. But now his fingers hovered over the leather cover like it might burn him. Instead, he slid it back onto the hall table. If she was going to tell him, she would. And if she wasn't, he'd know soon enough. In the room above, Grace stared at the ceiling, whispering his son's name like a prayer. Not because she was trying to claim him, but because she was trying to let him go. Eli stared at the journal all morning. It sat on the hall table like an unopened letter, small and unobtrusive, but humming with potential. Every time he walked by it, he felt a tug, not just of curiosity, but of dread. He knew what he'd seen on the first page, Milo Turner, over and over again, like a meditation or a wound. By the time the snow had stopped falling and the sky turned from steel gray to an indifferent blue, he finally picked it up. He didn't flip through it. He didn't violate the rest of it, just held it in his hands. The leather cover was soft from years of use, and along the edges the pages were curled. It wasn't a notebook, it was a lifeline, something a person wrote in when they had no one else to talk to. He set it back down. Some things, he figured, needed to be given, not taken. Grace was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, washing dishes as if she'd always belonged there. She'd found her way around the house quickly, though she moved carefully, like someone tiptoeing through someone else's memory. Milo was bundled up by the front door, trying to tie his boots. "Can we go sledding today?" he called out. Eli reached for his coat. "Only if you help shovel the walk after." "Deal," the boy grinned, popping up. Grace turned from the sink. "You need a second adult with you." Eli hesitated. Grace read his pause with precision. "I'm not asking for me. I just think he shouldn't be the only one having fun." Eli studied her for a moment before nodding. "All right, but you'll need better boots." The field behind. Their house was nothing more than a wide, sloping hill, dotted with scrub trees and the occasional snow-drifted fence post. In the summer, it was golden with wildflowers and overgrown grass. In winter, it was a sheet of white, the kind that begged for laughter. Milo launched himself down the hill on his worn-out red sled, yelling with joy all the way to the bottom. Grace watched from the top, a pink flush on her cheeks, her borrowed coat 2 sizes too big but zipped all the way. "You were good to take him in," she said softly. Eli, standing beside her, kept his gaze on the hill. Didn't feel like a choice. He needed someone. And I had room. Grace smiled faintly. That's more than most people can say. A pause. I didn't write his name to scare you, she added. It's just, sometimes when you've lost something, saying its name keeps it close, even if only in your mind. Eli's breath clouded in the air. He's not something, he's someone. I know, Grace said, eyes steady. He's someone I think about every single day. Later that afternoon, while Milo napped in front of the fire, Eli stood in the kitchen drinking coffee. Grace sat at the table, hands wrapped around her mug like it was the only warm thing in the world. You knew he was here? Eli asked finally. She nodded. Not at first. I started with the adoption agency. I didn't ask for names, just confirmation that he'd been adopted, that he was okay. They didn't tell me where, just that he was alive, that he was safe. I should have left it there. But you didn't. Grace looked down. I couldn't. He waited. After the agency, I wrote a few letters. To myself, mostly. I started driving. No destination, just east. Vermont was never the plan. I didn't even know you lived here. Eli folded his arms. So how'd you find us? Grace hesitated. I stopped at a gas station outside of town. I recognized his name on a flyer, a school fundraiser. Milo Turner, 4th grade. There aren't a lot of Turners here. That's how you ended up in my shed. She nodded, shame washing over her face. I just needed to see him from a distance, but then the snow came and I panicked. Eli didn't speak for a while. The quiet stretched between them, uncomfortable but not cruel. You could have knocked, he said eventually. Grace smiled, tired. I didn't think I deserved to. That night, after Grace had gone upstairs and Milo was asleep, Eli sat alone by the fire. He turned the journal over in his hands again. This time, he opened it to the second page. There were no wild revelations. No master plans, just entries. Some dated back 10 years, one read. He would have been 3 today. I wonder if he has curls. I used to think he would. Another, every year I think it'll hurt less. But I still see him in every brown-eyed boy who laughs like the world can't touch him. And another, if you ever find this, I hope you know I wasn't strong. But I loved you. I loved you so much I gave you up because I thought someone else could. Give you more than I ever could. Eli closed the book gently. He hadn't cried in years. Not since the funeral. Not even when he'd held Milo for the first time in that sterile government office, his hands shaking as the social worker handed him the bundle of blankets with big eyes inside. But tonight, a single tear traced down his weathered cheek and disappeared into his beard, not because he felt threatened, not because he felt angry, but because he understood. Eli lay in bed that night with the journal on the nightstand, spine closed tight, like it knew it held more than he was ready to face. He hadn't opened it past the first few pages, but those alone had unsettled him. Not just because Grace had written Milo's name, but because of how she'd written it, not like a stranger. Not like someone researching from afar, more like someone grieving something that had once been hers. The wind howled outside the window, rattling the shutters. Beside him the bed was empty. It had been for years, and somehow tonight it felt emptier than usual. The next morning, Eli called out of work for the first time in months, said it was the snow, said the roads hadn't cleared. It wasn't a lie, not exactly, just not the whole truth. Milo was at school. Grace was in the kitchen, humming softly, kneading bread again, like it was the only thing keeping her from floating away. Eli pulled his coat on, said something about needing to run an errand, and drove into town. He didn't head to the store. He drove to the county office. The building was a squat brick structure with a sagging roof and a front desk manned by a woman named Sandra, who had worked there since dial-up internet. She smiled when she saw Eli. Haven't seen you in a while. Yeah, I'm looking for some records, he said, clearing his throat. Adoption-related. From 10 years ago. Her face shifted just slightly. Not closed, but cautious. Yours? He nodded. My son, Milo. I know it was a closed case. I'm not asking for names or contact info. I need to understand something. Sandra tapped a few keys. You're on the file, so I can pull the general paperwork. You remember the agency? Heartline Family Services. That helps. She disappeared into the back and returned 15 minutes later with a thin file folder. No identifying names for the birth mother, like you said. But there is a note. Eli looked up. It's from the intake report, she explained. Some cases the birth mother leaves. A letter. Not often, but sometimes. This one didn't leave a letter, but she left a name. For him, Eli swallowed. Milo. Sandra nodded. It's written here, under preferred name if allowed. She wrote Milo, because it means merciful. He closed his eyes. She never asked for updates, never reached out after placement, but that name, she gave it. He nodded once, taking the folder in hand. Thanks, Sandra. Eli sat in the truck for a long time after that. He didn't cry. He didn't rage, but he did stare out at the snowy parking lot, heart heavy with something he couldn't name. A mix of guilt, confusion, and an aching kind of understanding. Grace hadn't come here to steal anything. She hadn't even come here with a plan. She had given that boy his name, and then she had walked away. What kind of pain did that take? And what kind of woman was she now, that she could sit across the table from that same boy, her boy, and not reach for him? That night, Eli barely touched his dinner. Milo chatted on about school, about how his teacher had let them play with shaving cream to practice cursive, and how he accidentally made a heart instead of the letter M, and how everyone teased him for having a crush. Grace laughed, not teasing, just warm, encouraging. Eli watched her with new eyes, not suspicious, not uncertain, just searching. After Milo went to bed, Eli stayed in the kitchen, stacking dishes, wiping down already clean counters. Grace joined him, leaning against the doorframe. You're quiet. I had a long day. You went into town? He nodded. She didn't press, Grace, he said after a moment. Why did you name him Milo? She stiffened slightly. I'm not sure I know how to answer that. Try. She looked at the floor, then up at him. I was 19, scared, alone. But when I felt him kick for the first time, something shifted. I wanted him to be strong. But more than that, I wanted him to be kind, to be bigger than what the world might throw at him. Eli exhaled slowly. You chose right. Grace blinked back, sudden tears. I'm not here to take him. I never was. I know, he said. I read the file today. I saw your name for him. It wasn't just a name, it was a gift. She covered her mouth with her hand, breath catching. I've been holding on to that name for 10 years, she whispered. Just the name, nothing else. He stepped closer. You gave him life. I've been lucky enough to raise him. But none of this, none of it, works unless we trust each other. She nodded, eyes full but unflinching. I want to trust you, he said. I do, but I need to know, are you staying or are you just passing through? Grace looked at him like he'd asked the one question she'd been too afraid to answer. I don't know, she said. I want to stay, more than anything, but I don't know if I deserve it. Eli reached out, his hand brushing hers. Then let's figure that out together. In the hallway that night, Eli paused outside Milo's door. He peeked in. The boy was sleeping soundly, his little chest rising and falling, the corner of his blanket curled in his hand. A child who had been loved from the beginning, even when he didn't know it, even when the love had been hidden in silence. And now maybe it didn't have to be any more. The sky turned to pewter by mid-afternoon, casting a muted grey light across the house. Snow had stopped falling, but the world outside remained frozen. a still life in white and silence. Inside, the air smelled faintly of apples and cinnamon. Grace had baked a pie, not because she was asked, but because it gave her hands something to do. She moved about the kitchen with practiced grace, her sleeves rolled up, apron dusted in flour, hair tied back loosely. She looked for a moment like any other woman making something warm on a cold day. Eli watched her from the hallway, arms crossed, leaning against the wall like he was afraid to step farther into whatever this was becoming. "Where'd you learn to bake?" he asked. She glanced over her shoulder, then smiled softly. "Foster home in Wisconsin, Miss June. She baked when she was mad. I think she was mad most days." Eli chuckled under his breath. "Well, the kitchen smells better than mine ever has. That's because you eat like a man trying to survive the apocalypse." He raised an eyebrow. "You've been here 4 days. You're already judging my lifestyle?" She grinned, with affection. The pie went in the oven. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, but quiet, in the way that often precedes something. Long overdue. Grace took a seat at the table, folding her hands. "I think it's time I told you the truth. All of it." Eli didn't move. "All right." She exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath for a decade. "I was 19 when I got pregnant," she began, eyes fixed on her hands. "I was a sophomore in college, studying psychology, ironically. The father, he was gone before I could say the word. My parents were strict, devout, image-obsessed. When I told them, they gave me 2 options, abortion or adoption." Eli listened in silence. His face gave nothing away. "I couldn't go through with the first. I wanted to keep him. Milo. I'd already chosen the name. It meant merciful. I liked that. But my parents said they'd cut me off. No school, no support, no home. I was scared. I was tired. And I was alone." She swallowed hard. "So, I signed the papers. I held him once. Just once. He was so small. He looked at me and I thought, God, I've made a mistake. But it was too late." Eli's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I asked them to make it a closed adoption. I told myself it would be easier that way. Cleaner. But it wasn't. It never is. Every year on his birthday, I wrote him a letter in that journal. Not because I thought he'd read it, but because I needed someone to know that I remembered, that I never stopped." A tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly. "I wasn't strong. I gave him up thinking someone else would do better than I ever could, and I hated myself for it every day." Eli stepped into the kitchen finally, pulled out a chair, and sat across from her. "He doesn't know?" he asked. "No. I never intended to tell him. I didn't even know I'd end up here, Eli. That was never the plan." He nodded slowly. "But now you're here. I don't want to confuse him or hurt him. That's the last thing I want." Eli looked down at his hands, weathered and scarred from years of hard work. "You know, when I first got him, I had no idea what I was doing. My wife had just passed. Cancer. Fast and brutal. The adoption was something we'd started together. She didn't live to see it through." Grace's eyes softened. "They handed him to me and I stood there like an idiot thinking, how the hell do I do this alone?" Eli laughed faintly, shaking his head. "But then he grabbed my finger, just like that, held on, and I thought, maybe I don't have to know everything. Maybe I just have to show up." Grace smiled through tears. "You did more than that." "I tried," he said quietly. "Still trying." The timer dinged. The pie was done. Grace stood, wiped her cheeks, and took it from the oven. The crust was golden, the smell buttery and nostalgic. "Miss June would have been proud," Eli said. Grace turned, a tired smile blooming. She had a rule: if you're going to cry, at least do it near a pie. Eli chuckled, then turned serious again. "So, what happens now?" Grace hesitated. "You tell me. I'll follow your lead. I'm not here to take anything. I just needed to look at him once. Know he was real. No, he was okay. He's okay, Eli said. More than okay. She nodded, looking down. Good. He stood slowly, walked to the cabinet, and pulled down 3 plates. You staying for dessert? He asked. She looked up, eyes wide, uncertain. I mean, he added, seems a shame to waste a good pie. That night, after Milo had gone to bed, Grace stood on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the moon. Eli joined her, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. You cold? He asked. Not really, she said. Not tonight. They stood there for a long time, neither speaking, just breathing. And in the stillness between them, something shifted. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Enough to matter. The sun returned the next morning as if it had remembered its duties. After days of grey and snow, a pale gold light poured in through the kitchen window, catching on the steam from Grace's coffee and turning it to mist. Milo sat at the table, in his favourite flannel pyjamas, kicking his socked feet rhythmically against the chair legs while scribbling on a sheet of construction paper. "What are you working on, buddy?" Eli asked, pouring a second cup of coffee. "A card," Milo said without looking up. "For who?" Milo shrugged. "I don't know, maybe someone who needs it." Grace, standing at the sink, froze just slightly. Her hands didn't move, but she didn't turn around. Eli watched his son quietly. Milo wasn't an overly sentimental kid. He was smart, thoughtful, often private in his way of processing things. But every now and then he'd say something that reminded Eli just how intuitive he was. How much he felt, even if he didn't say it out loud. Grace turned slowly, drying her hands on a towel. "Can I see?" Milo hesitated, then nodded, holding it up shyly. It was a drawing of 3 stick figures standing under a tree, one taller. Man, a boy in the middle, and a woman with a long swish of yellow hair. The sun smiled down on them, oversized and crooked, and the words written in uneven letters across the top read, "Thank you for being kind." Grace blinked. Milo added softly, "You kinda remind me of someone. I don't know who." Eli cleared his throat. "Time to get dressed. Bus'll be here soon." Milo nodded and darted off up the stairs, leaving the card behind on the table like an unwrapped truth. Grace stood staring at it. "He doesn't know," she said quietly, "but he feels it." Eli picked up the card and smiled without showing teeth. "Yeah, he always was better at reading people than I am." After Milo left for school, Eli went to the shed to fix a broken hinge on the door. Grace followed, tucking her hands into her jacket pockets and squinting in the sun. "You fixed it after I left?" she asked, glancing toward the spot where she'd curled up that first night. "I fixed it because I couldn't stand the idea of someone else coming in and being cold," Eli replied without looking up. "Not again." Grace said nothing. She ran her fingers along the grain of the wood, almost tenderly. "I want to tell him one day," she said. "Not now, not while it's still raw, but someday, when he's older." Eli stood, brushing sawdust off his jeans. "Then that's your decision, but it'll be your story to tell, not mine. I wouldn't take him away from you," she added quickly. "I know." The breeze picked up. Wind whispered through the trees like the ghosts of winter's past. Grace shivered. "You believe in intuition?" she asked suddenly. Eli cocked an eyebrow. "I believe in fixing what's broken. I believe in loyalty. Intuition. Never gave it much thought." Grace smiled. "I used to think I was imagining things. Those moments. Flashes, I guess. I'd pass a playground and my chest would ache. I'd hear a child laugh in the grocery store and freeze. Every year on his birthday I'd have a dream. Same one. A little boy I couldn't catch up to, running ahead through a field, always just out of reach." Eli stared at her for a long moment, then said, "I think that's more than intuition." "Maybe," she said. "But whatever it is, it brought me here." That afternoon, Grace offered to pick Milo up from school. Eli hesitated, not because he didn't trust her, strangely he did, but because something about it made the situation feel more real, more permanent. He agreed anyway. At the school gates, Milo came bounding out, grinning as he spotted her. "Grace!" he shouted, waving his arms. She crouched to greet him. "Hey, bud, good day?" "Yeah, we had music. I played the tambourine and didn't mess up once." She laughed. "That's impressive." He took her hand without thinking as they walked back to the truck. "Can you stay for Christmas?" he asked. Grace's breath caught. I don't know," she said gently. "That's up to your dad." "I hope you can," Milo said simply. "I like it better when you're here." That night, as the snow returned in flurries, Grace sat in the living room flipping through a photo album Eli had pulled from a cardboard box in the closet. "This was his first Halloween," Eli said, pointing to a photo of baby Milo dressed as a bumblebee, frowning at the camera. Grace laughed softly. "He hated the hat, didn't he? Ripped it off 5 times before we left the house." Another photo, Milo holding a toy truck, grinning, cheeks red from the cold. Grace's fingers lingered on that one. "I missed so much," she whispered. Eli, sitting beside her, said, "You can still catch up." Grace shook her head. "You don't just walk back into someone's life and pick up where you left off?" "No," Eli agreed, "but sometimes you find a new way forward." Later, when Milo was tucked in bed, he called for Grace softly. She peeked her head in. "Hey, need something?" He looked up, blinking sleepily. "Will you sing again? That song from the other night, the one with the stars." Grace hesitated. "You sang it when we lost power," he added. "I liked it." Her throat tightened. "Of course." She sat on the edge of the bed and began to hum, then sing, soft, careful, like folding a fragile memory into the air. The lullaby was one she'd made up during her pregnancy, back when Milo was only a presence inside her, kicking and quiet and waiting. Milo's eyes fluttered closed. She ran a hand over his hair once. "I think I dreamed that song," he murmured. Grace blinked away tears. "Maybe you did." She sat beside him long after he'd fallen asleep, the tune still echoing in her chest, like something found and forgiven. The following days were filled with small routines that settled over the house like falling snow. Quiet, almost imperceptible, but steady. Grace helped with laundry, tidied the living room, and baked like she had something to prove. Eli didn't stop her, and Milo didn't question it. It was as if, by some silent agreement, she had been folded into the fabric of their lives, a new thread sewn into a familiar pattern. That Saturday, the sky was a dazzling, cloudless blue, the kind that only comes after a hard freeze, when the air is cold enough to sting, but the sun shines anyway, like it's trying to make up for something. Grace came downstairs early, hair still damp from the shower, cheeks flushed from the steam. She wore one of Eli's old flannel shirts over her own sweater. Sleeves rolled up, she looked both relaxed and guarded, a woman who was learning how to breathe in someone else's house. "I was thinking of baking," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Do you like cinnamon bread?" Eli glanced up from the morning paper. "I mean, if it smells as good as it tastes, I'll be the first in line." "Good," she said, already pulling out bowls and ingredients. "It's my mother's recipe. One of the few good things she left behind." Eli didn't ask about the rest. The house filled slowly with the smell of cinnamon, sugar, and something richer, comfort, maybe. Grace worked with quiet concentration, humming to herself as she kneaded the dough, her fingers moving with practiced memory. Milo came in mid-morning, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and immediately perked up. "Are you making French toast bread?" he asked hopefully. "Better," Grace grinned. "Cinnamon swirl. If we're lucky, it won't last the day." Eli watched from the doorway. There was something magnetic about the ease she had in the kitchen. Not performative, not flashy, just simple competence. It reminded him of how his late wife used to hum while peeling apples, how the sound had once filled the house with something like home. Grace caught him looking and offered a half-smile. "Want to help?" "I don't know the first thing about baking." "Even better. No bad habits." She handed him a mixing spoon. He took it, mock suspicious. "This isn't a trap, is it?" "Only if you mess up the swirl," she teased. An hour later, the three of them sat around the table, the first loaf already half gone. Milo had sugar on his chin and crumbs on his sweatshirt. Eli had butter on his thumb. Grace, surprisingly, had none of the mess but all the satisfaction. "This is dangerously good," Eli said, taking another bite. Grace sipped her coffee. "Miss June used to say that a kitchen without cinnamon was a sad one." "You've mentioned her before," Eli said gently. "She was your foster mom?" Grace nodded. "My second one. The first family didn't stick." "What happened?" "They wanted someone younger. A baby. I was 6. Already had opinions." Eli smiled faintly. "I've got one of those upstairs." "You're lucky," she said more quietly this time. "He's kind. He listens. He gets that from his mom." Grace looked down at her mug. "She must have been something." "She was," Eli said after a beat. "Strong, funny. The kind of woman who saw through you but never judged you. She taught piano, said music was how she prayed." Grace nodded, her expression softening. "Sounds like someone I would have liked. I think she would have liked you too." Their eyes met, a long, steady look that held no tension, only the possibility of something neither of them had, spoken aloud. Later that afternoon, while Milo was outside building a lopsided snowman, Eli and Grace brought firewood in from the stack behind the shed. They worked in tandem, passing logs back and forth, brushing snow from the pile. The air was crisp, the kind that bit at fingers but left your lungs feeling clean. "You always lived in small towns?" Grace asked, brushing snow from her sleeves. "Mostly. Spent a year in Chicago after high school. Didn't stick. Too much noise." She smiled. "Funny. I ran to the city to disappear. Guess I needed the noise. And now I'm learning how to listen again." Eli paused, balancing an armload of firewood. "To what?" She looked up. "To quiet, to stillness, to things that don't shout to be heard." They stood there for a moment, wood between them, breath misting the air. Eli lowered his gaze, cleared his throat. "Let's get this inside before we both freeze." That evening, after dinner and hot cocoa, Milo went to bed early, worn out from snowball battles and cinnamon overload. Eli lingered in the kitchen, drying the last of the mugs. Grace stood nearby, folding the dish towel with care. "Thank you," he said suddenly. She looked over, surprised. "For what?" "For this. Today. The bread, the stories, just being here." Grace didn't answer right away. Then she stepped forward, close enough that he could see the faint scar near her eyebrow, the one he hadn't noticed before. "I'm grateful too," she said. "For you, for him, for the second chance I didn't expect." There was a moment, not dramatic, not cinematic, but real, where it felt like the air shifted between them. A glance held just a beat too long. A breath drawn but not released. "Step back first. Good night, Grace." She nodded slowly. "Good night, Eli." Upstairs, Grace stood by her window, looking out over the snowy field beyond the backyard. The moon cast long shadows across the ground, stretching like memories toward the tree line. She pressed a hand to the glass and whispered, "Please don't let me break this." Below, Eli sat in the living room, staring into the fire. A half-empty mug of coffee cooling in his hand. He didn't know what scared him more, the warmth that had crept back into his life, or how much he wanted it to stay. The storm rolled in just past midnight, quiet at first. A slow rising wind whispering across the roof, shingles like a warning. By morning, the sky was churning with thick clouds, and by noon, the snow fell heavy, wet and insistent. Eli stood by the front window, arms crossed, watching the world disappear in white. The snowplow hadn't made it up the road yet, and the weather report on the radio used phrases like hunker down and extreme caution. "Looks like we're stuck in for the night," he said, glancing toward Grace, who was wrapping a blanket around Milo on the couch. She smiled. "There are worse places to be." The power flickered twice before noon, then again just after dinner. At 7, the house went dark with a final decisive click. Lights off, heater silenced, refrigerator humming into nothingness. Milo let out a soft, "uh-oh." Eli was already on his feet, reaching for the drawer that held the flashlights. "And candles." "It's all right, kiddo. We've been through worse." Grace stood. "I'll help." Together they lit the candles, stubby wax stumps with mismatched scents. Pine, vanilla, one that smelled vaguely like cinnamon and motor oil. The house glowed in golden pools, the shadows dancing like memories across the walls. The three of them gathered in the living room, bundled in blankets, fire crackling low in the stove. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the window panes and pressing against the house like a creature wanting in. Milo was curled up between them, his head on Eli's shoulder, feet tucked under Grace's leg. The closeness wasn't awkward anymore, it just was. "You ever lose power for a long time?" Milo asked, voice muffled in Eli's flannel. "Once," Eli said. "Back when I was a kid. Whole neighborhood went dark for 2 days. My dad made us roast hot dogs in the fireplace. We thought it was the greatest thing ever." Grace smiled. "When I was little, we lost power every winter. I was in a group home then. The caretaker used to tell us ghost stories by candlelight." Milo perked up. "Can you tell one?" Grace laughed. "I think tonight might be scary enough without adding ghosts to it." Milo pouted. "Then a song?" Eli glanced at her. Grace hesitated. The fire popped. "All right," she said softly. "One song." She began to hum first, a tune so gentle it barely registered above the wind. Then, with a voice low and warm, she sang a lullaby. The melody was simple, old-fashioned, with a rhythm that swayed like rocking on a porch swing. "Sleep, my darling, stars are high, keep their watch across the sky, moonlight soft upon your face, hearts like ours leave no trace." Milo's eyes fluttered, lashes trembling, then closed. Eli watched her. Not the way a man watches a stranger, but the way someone watches something they thought they'd never see again. Not exactly love, not yet, but a longing for something close. When Milo had fallen asleep, Grace gently slid a pillow beneath his head and tucked the blanket around his small shoulders. She stood, stretching silently, and walked over to the window. "You made that up," Eli said from behind her. She didn't turn. "I did." "When?" "A long time ago. When I was pregnant. I'd sing it in the car or in the shower. I needed something. Something that was just mine and his." Eli stood slowly. "He remembers it." She turned, brows furrowed. "Last week," Eli continued, "he said you sang a song he'd heard in a dream. That was before you ever sang it here." Grace's mouth opened, then closed. "Sometimes I think kids hold on to things we can't explain," he said. She nodded slowly. "There's a part of me that always hoped that somehow something of me stayed with him." They were quiet for a long time. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the silence was thick with the weight of unspoken truths. "You're good with him," Eli said at last. Grace looked down. "I don't know if I deserve to be." "You're here. You're kind, you're present," she shook her head. "Being here now doesn't erase not being there then." "No," Eli agreed, "but it counts." Her eyes welled up. "Sometimes I wonder if he would have been better off with someone else entirely. A real family, a mother and father." "You think any of us get it perfect?" Eli asked. "You think I've never wondered if I've done enough? If I've loved him the right way? I lose sleep over that. All the time." She looked at him, startled. He stepped closer. "You're not the only one walking around with guilt like a coat, you."
Can't take off.
She let out a breath. "It's heavy." He nodded. "Yeah, but it's warmer with two." They both laughed. Quiet, surprised by it. Not because anything was funny, but because it had been so long since anything had felt that light. The candles burned low. The fire sank into embers. Grace sat back on the couch, pulling her knees to her chest. "I don't want to leave," she whispered. Eli didn't respond right away. He walked to the window, looked out at the darkened road, then turned back to her. "Then don't." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't even a proposition. It was permission. Grace's eyes shimmered in the candlelight, but she said nothing. They sat, in silence, listening to the wind. Outside, the storm began to die. Inside, something else began to settle. Not closure, not certainty, but the beginning of peace. The morning after the storm was impossibly bright. The snow had stopped, the sun had returned, and the world outside sparkled like it had been polished overnight. Inside the house, though, there was a hush that felt less like peace and more like something waiting to break. Grace stood by the window with a mug in her hand, watching Milo shovel the walk. He'd insisted on doing it himself, said he was strong enough now, and he was, mostly. He paused between scoops to toss snowballs at a tree, laughing when they fell harmlessly short. "He's going to be okay," Eli said, coming up beside her. "No matter what happens." She didn't turn. "That's what scares me." Eli glanced at her. "Why?" "Because it means I could leave, and he'd still be okay." He took a breath. "Are you planning to leave?" She set the mug down. Carefully. "I think I should." "Why?" The word came out sharper than he intended. "Because I'm blurring lines that aren't mine to cross. Because he's growing attached, and so am I. And sooner or later, he'll start asking questions we're not ready to answer." "You think leaving will fix that?" Grace shook her head. "No, but staying might break something worse." Later that afternoon, Eli went into town for supplies. The roads were finally plowed, and the grocery shelves were half empty but functional. He didn't rush, didn't dawdle either. Just moved through the aisles with the quiet detachment of someone who had a lot on his mind and not enough clarity to process it all. When he returned home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Milo was at a friend's for a play date, something Grace had encouraged that morning with forced cheerfulness, and Grace was at the kitchen table, a manila envelope in front of her, unopened. Eli's eyes narrowed. "What's that?" She pushed it toward him gently. "It's the temporary guardianship form. I downloaded it last night." He didn't touch it. "I don't understand," he said. "I thought if something happened to you, if there was an emergency, maybe you'd want it in place, just for a while, just until you figure out what's next." Eli sat down across from her slowly. "This isn't just about emergencies." Grace looked at him, eyes steady. "No, it's about being realistic. I'm not his mother in any legal sense. I'm not even family. I'm just a woman who showed up in your shed with a notebook full of guilt." He exhaled, long and quiet. "You're more than that." "Not on paper. Paper doesn't raise a kid." "No," she agreed, "but it protects one." They didn't speak again for a while. Not about the paperwork, not about anything that mattered. They made dinner, chili and cornbread, and sat at the table like any other night. But Milo noticed something was different. "Are you guys mad?" he asked, glancing between them. "Nobody," Eli said. "Just tired." Grace smiled. "We had to deal with boring adult stuff today. Nothing for you to worry about." Milo relaxed. "Okay, because I was gonna say, I don't like when the kitchen gets quiet. Feels like something sad is hiding." Eli's chest tightened. Grace reached over and ruffled the boy's hair. "Nothing's hiding, kiddo. Promise." That night, after Milo went to bed, Eli stood in the hallway outside Grace's room. Envelope in hand, she opened the door before he could knock. "You're not the only one scared," he said. "I think about what happens if you leave, not just for him, for me." Her breath caught. "I've spent years keeping things steady, predictable, safe, and then you showed up and everything got complicated. I didn't mean to." He raised a hand. "I know, and I don't blame you, but complicated doesn't mean bad. Sometimes it just means real." Grace leaned against the doorframe. "I keep thinking that if I stay, I'll ruin everything, but if I go, I might regret it for the rest of my life." "Sounds familiar," Eli said softly. She smiled, broken and beautiful. "I want to do what's best for him." "So do I." They looked at each other for a long time. Then quietly Grace said, "Will you sign it?" Eli opened the envelope and pulled out the papers. He scanned them, then reached for a pen. "I'll sign it," he said. "But not because I expect something to happen to me, and not because I think you need permission." "Then why?" He met her gaze. "Because he needs all the love he can get, and you have it to give." She blinked back tears. "Thank you." The next morning, Milo found the envelope on the table, tucked neatly beside the salt shaker. He turned to Grace, curious. "What's this?" She hesitated. "Just something for safekeeping." "Is it important?" "Yes," she said, "but not in the way you think." He nodded, like he understood more than she gave him credit for. Then, with a small grin, he said, "Good, 'cause I was afraid it meant you were leaving." Grace's heart ached. She knelt down beside him. "I don't want to leave." "Then don't," he said simply. She pulled him into her arms and held him like something fragile, not because he was, but because her own heart felt like glass. And in that moment, she knew. Leaving wouldn't protect anyone, but staying, truly, staying just might heal them all. The house was quiet on Christmas Eve, the kind of quiet that feels too big for the space it fills. There was no music playing, no cinnamon bread in the oven, no laughter drifting from the living room. The tree stood decorated, soft white lights, twinkling like hopeful stars, but something was missing, not a thing, but a presence. Grace had left that morning. She hadn't said goodbye in the dramatic sense. No tears, no final speech. Just a simple folded note on the kitchen table, weighed down by the ceramic sugar jar. "Eli, thank you for letting me stay. Thank you for your kindness, and for Milo's laughter, and for reminding me that I still have something to offer the world." This was never supposed to be a permanent stop, but it became something I'll carry with me always. If it's meant to be more, I trust that life will find a way to bring us back together. With gratitude, Grace Eli had read the note 3 times. Then once more, slower. He hadn't moved it from the table. He hadn't thrown it away either. He just sat with it like something sacred. Milo hadn't said much. He'd noticed Grace's absence immediately, of course. He wasn't the kind of kid who needed things spelled out. "She gone?" he asked softly. "Yeah," Eli said. "She needed time." Milo had only nodded, quietly retreating to his room. No crying, no tantrum, just silence. That was what worried Eli the most. That afternoon, Eli busied himself with the things that didn't require thinking. Splitting kindling, checking the propane, reorganizing the pantry, as if order in the physical world could compensate for the ache inside him. But nothing filled the space Grace had left behind. Not in the air, not in the boy upstairs, and certainly not in him. Just before dinner, he noticed a sealed envelope on the counter addressed in pencil. "To Grace from Milo." The handwriting was careful and slow, the way children write when they want something to matter. Eli picked it up, heart tight in his chest. He tapped gently on Milo's door. "Hey, bud, what's this?" Milo was sitting cross-legged on the rug, coloring. He looked up, expression unreadable. "It's for her. You want me to mail it?" "No," Milo said. "I want you to take it." Eli crouched down. Might not be expecting visitors right now. I know, Milo said simply, but maybe she's hoping for one. An hour later, Eli was on the road. Grace hadn't gone far. She'd told him once, almost casually, that if she ever left, she'd head to Maple Hollow, a small inn outside of town she remembered from a Foster trip years ago. Quiet, off the grid. Just enough to disappear without going far. The inn was tucked off a side road, partially hidden behind tall fir trees and a picket fence coated in snow. A single lantern glowed on the porch, and a thin ribbon of smoke curled from the chimney. Eli parked the truck and sat for a moment, the letter in his hand, wondering what the right thing was, and if right even existed when it came to matters of the heart. He knocked. Grace answered, sweater sleeves pulled over her hands, hair in a loose braid, eyes tired and swollen. "You look like someone who didn't expect a knock," he said. She smiled faintly. "I didn't." He held up the envelope. "This is from Milo." Her hand trembled slightly as she took it. "You didn't read it? Didn't need to?" She stepped aside. "Come in?" He nodded and entered. The room was warm and dim, the scent of pine and firewood hanging in the air. A single suitcase sat in the corner, unopened. Grace sat on the edge of the bed and opened the envelope with delicate fingers. She read in silence, lips parting slightly as her eyes moved line by line. When she finished, she placed the letter on her lap and pressed a hand to her chest. "He said," she began, voice cracking. "He said he knows I'm his mother." Eli nodded slowly. He knew before either of us said it. Grace stared down at the page. "He said he doesn't care about the past, that he just wants me around, that it feels better when I'm there." Eli watched her for a long moment. "He's right," he said. "It is better." Grace looked up, surprised. "Eli, I was angry," he admitted. "Not at you, at what it all stirred up, the fear, the memories, the risk of losing him, or losing myself in something I didn't expect." She blinked back tears. "But I've realized something," he continued. "It's not safer to keep your world small, it's just lonelier." Grace stood, crossing the small room, until she stood inches from him. "I didn't come back into his life to take anything from you," she whispered. "I know. I never expected this. You, him, any of it. Neither did I." They stood there, hearts open, walls lowered. "I miss the sound of your voice in my house," Eli said quietly. "I miss your bread and your humming, and how you sit too close to the fire like you're chasing warmth you think you don't deserve." Grace laughed softly through a tear. "You notice too much. I've had practice." He reached out and took her hand. "I don't know what this is yet," he said, "but I know I don't want it to end here." Grace nodded, eyes shining. "Neither do I." That night, they drove back in silence, a silence rich with something unspoken but understood. Milo was asleep when they arrived, his letter still open on the kitchen table. Grace picked it up, folded it gently, and tucked it into her coat. Pocket like a treasure, Eli stood behind her, watching. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "Good," he replied, "because we just got started." The new year tiptoed in with a hush. No fireworks, no fanfare, just the soft hush of falling snow, the crackle of firewood, and the slow, steady rhythm of a house rediscovering its heart. In the days since Grace returned, everything had begun to settle, not back to what it had been, but into something new, something not yet named but deeply felt. They didn't talk much about the past. There was no need. The present was full enough. Milo had taken to calling her Grace, though every now and then, when he thought no one was listening, he slipped and said Mom. He'd catch himself, cheeks pink, but Grace never corrected him. She'd simply smile and let the word hang in the air like something sacred. One morning, Eli found her in the backyard, bundled in his old parka, standing under the apple tree. The branches were bare but not lifeless. Buds were beginning to form, quiet little promises tucked into the bark. He walked up beside her, hands in his coat pockets. "Thought I'd find you here," he said. Grace smiled without turning. "It's silly, but this tree reminds me of myself. I thought it was dead when I first saw it, but it was just waiting." "For what?" "Warmth," she said. "A reason to bloom again." Eli looked up at the gnarled limbs overhead. "It's been here longer than I have. We almost cut it down once. Too much trouble, not enough fruit. And now," he shrugged, "now I think it's earned its place." She turned to him then, snowflakes catching in her hair. "So have I?" He didn't smile. Not exactly, but his eyes softened in that way she'd come to know. "You've always belonged here," he said. "Even when you didn't know it." They never made a grand announcement. There was no dramatic declaration or formal "will you move in" conversation. It just happened. Grace started leaving her books on the end table. Her coat hung on the peg beside Eli's. Her laughter filled the kitchen. Her handwriting appeared on grocery lists and notes for Milo's school. They lived around each other, like two melodies that had found a harmony neither one expected. One Saturday afternoon in March, the town held a small spring festival on the green. Nothing big, just booths with maple syrup, crafts, and local music. Milo tugged on Grace's hand. "You have to come. They have the best apple fritters." "I've never had one," she admitted. Eli gasped in mock horror. "You've never had Frankie Mullin's apple fritters?" She raised an eyebrow. "Should I be scared?" "Absolutely," he grinned. The three of them wandered from stall to stall, laughing in the late winter sun. Grace bought a hand-knit scarf for Eli and let Milo eat too much sugar. They listened to a folk trio play old songs that made the older folks sway and the younger ones roll their eyes. And when Eli slipped his arm around her waist as they watched Milo dance in circles, Grace leaned into him like she'd been doing it her whole life. That night, after the dishes were done, and Milo had fallen asleep with a book on his chest, Eli found Grace in the living room, curled up with a blanket. She looked up as he entered. "Do you ever think we got here by accident?" He shook his head. "No, I think we got here by surviving." She tilted her head. "That sounds more painful than romantic." Eli walked over and sat beside her. "Maybe, but I think the most beautiful things in life come from people who didn't give up, on themselves, on each other, even when they had every reason to." Grace rested her head on his shoulder. "Do you still worry?" she asked. "Every day," he said. "But now I worry about things that matter, like whether Milo's happy, whether you've had enough coffee, whether the roof's going to leak when the snow melts." She laughed. "That's love, huh?" He nodded. "Love's not always big gestures. Sometimes it's just showing up. Every single day." Spring arrived in full bloom by mid-April. The apple tree blossomed, white and pink petals, like a celebration written across the sky. Grace stood under it one morning, a mug of coffee in hand, and smiled at the sight of Milo racing across the yard, barefoot, chasing a kite Eli had helped him build. Eli came up behind her, slid his arms around her waist, and kissed the top of her head. "Still think you're leaving someday?" he asked softly. She leaned back into him. "Not anymore," she said. "I found what I didn't even know I was looking for." On the first truly warm day, they set up a small table under the apple tree for dinner, just the three of them. Grace lit candles. Eli grilled chicken. Milo told stories about school that were half truth, half myth, all joy. As the sun dipped below the hills, Eli raised his glass. "To the ones we lost," he said softly, "and the ones we found." They clinked glasses. Grace looked across the table at the boy who had once been her deepest ache, now her daily miracle, and at the man who had stepped into the dark and built a life from scratch. She felt, for the first time in years, whole, not perfect, not without scars, but whole. Years from now, When Milo would look back on his childhood, he wouldn't remember the exact moment Grace moved in, or the first time Eli held her hand. What he would remember was warmth, safety, the smell of cinnamon bread, the sound of a lullaby hummed softly beneath a winter storm. And he'd remember that sometimes family isn't found all at once. Sometimes it arrives in pieces, unexpected, messy, miraculous, and when it does, the only thing left to do is open the door. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. Whether you're from a small town like Eli's or halfway across the world, your stories matter too. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tap the notification bell so you never miss the next story filled with hope, kindness, and second chances. Thank you so much for spending time with us today. We hope this story reminded you that no matter how cold the winter, love always has a way of finding its way home. Until next time, take care, stay warm, and be kind.